we saw the 2.5 tribes that inherited land east of the Jordan, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh, before crossing over the Jordan to return home, built an altar west of the Jordan. The children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by the Jordan, a great, impressive altar. These tribes did something that on the surface looked really bad. They built a great and impressive altar on the west side of the Jordan. Contrary to the belief that this altar was built to encourage idolatry or to encourage sacrifices to be offered in places other than the tabernacle, the opposite was actually true. No sacrifices would be offered on it, nor would worship be held there. Those things were reserved for the tabernacle. This altar, which was a replica of the one in the tabernacle, was thus built as a witness between the tribes on the west and the tribes on the east that they were all one congregation, worshiping the true God of heaven, the God of Israel. Remember, God's sacrifices were to be offered in the tabernacle on the altars there. They were not to be offered here, there, and everywhere.
Urijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it, and he trades the good, right, godly altar for some wicked, heathen, satanic altar. It says, and he brought also the brazen altar which was before the Lord from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. Shame on Urijah the priest, for if anyone should know better, it's the priest. He needs to say, I am not going to build an altar unto some false god. We're not going to change the altar of the Lord. The altar that was built after the heavenly altar. Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God and cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God and shut up the doors of the house of the Lord. And he made him altars in every corner of Jerusalem.
Temples outside of Jerusalem existed in a second temple period. And there was a temple at Elephantine.
So Elephantine is this island in the Nile River on the southern border of Egypt, where you had these Jewish soldiers who were serving there. And one of the things you were able to do is map a layout of Elephantine, of the Jewish area, of individual houses based on these contracts. One of the most important collections of documents in Jewish history. But this is not something that, I mean, you have these incredible discoveries, and we're not being told about these things, certainly I think in popular Jewish culture. I don't know why that is. I mean, these are really important documents. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there are about 20 family documents, and they have houses, and the houses give 4 borders, above, below, east, west. And among the borders is the temple of Yahweh.
So talk about the temple. We have to talk about the temple. The temple of Yahweh, of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh at Elephantine. What is a Jewish temple to the God of Israel doing at Elephantine? I would understand a synagogue, which is obviously somewhat of a later concept, but this is actually a temple where they brought sacrifices.
Because of the paganization of the Jerusalem temple, the priests fled to Egypt, and they set up their own temple.
Okay. So you're saying these were priests. Okay, this is interesting. So you're saying they were fled from the paganization of the Jerusalem temple. These priests weren't exactly, I'm not sure Jeremiah would have been very happy with these priests. Let's put it that way.
All evidence points to the fact that these Judeans truly thought that it was an act of piety to worship their God by offering sacrifices through the mediating oversight of a priest at a temple that was not the Jerusalem temple. Again, you should be shocked by this because there's so much material in our Tanakh that says, do not build Bamo.
From what we can reconstruct, it would seem that round about the year 650 BC, Pharaoh Psamtik I already had Greek mercenaries, and he added to them Jewish mercenaries as the garrison on the border fortress of Elephantine. They were here for 2.5 centuries, right down to 400 BC. Generation after generation, children grew up and followed their fathers into the military service, the mercenary service.
So that probably was phase 1 of this migration back down to Egypt.
Interestingly, time and again in their documents, they refer to or swear by the great god Yahweh. They also brought with them other Canaanite gods, and their documents refer to Anath Bethel and her consort Ashim Bethel, And they swear by these gods also. You can understand why the biblical prophets so often inveighed against the mixing of religions, where the true worship of God was adulterated with the worship of other deities.
So we have these people who are worshiping the God of Israel, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh, they call him. And alongside that, they're also worshiping Anat. And maybe Anat is that queen of heaven, right? I think you suggest that in your book. And all the people who were dwelling in the land of Egypt and Patros saying, the words which you spoke to us in the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, we don't listen to you.
You should also mention he
Yes.
speaks about Patros.
Right.
Now, Patros is the district that includes Elephantine. Pa, ta, Resi. Pa, the, ta is country, and Resi is south, the southern country. So he doesn't mention Jeremiah Elephantine by name, but there are obviously Jews living in that whole area. They settled in the south.
So this is absolutely incredible. This isn't just an overlap. They're not just talking about similar things. Jeremiah is literally talking about the thing that continued at Elephantine.
When the Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BC, they took over the government, and the Jewish mercenaries were only too happy to change sides. They didn't care who paid their wages as long as they were paid. And it came about that the Persians also used them as a garrison, but this time not just against the Nubians in the south, but also to keep control of the local population of Egyptians. And the Egyptians had the unfortunate experience of finding their former employees now their rulers, and it didn't go down too well. In the year 410, the Persian satrap Arsames went back to Persia for consultations with the king, with the government, and the priests of Khnum here on Elephantine promptly took advantage of his absence and bribed the local garrison commander, a man called Widrang, to look the other way while his son and a group of non-Jewish mercenaries crossed over from this shore over to Elephantine, where they promptly beat up every Jew they could find and razed the temple of Yahweh to the ground, burnt it, destroyed it completely.
And we've been destroyed by sword and by famine. So this is incredible. So here they're complaining to Jeremiah, saying, "Look, we did what you told us to do, and only bad things happened to us. We should have kept doing what our kings did, burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations. We will surely keep the oaths which we have sworn to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven." Then I love Jeremiah's answer. "Therefore, says Lord Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, behold, I swear by my great name." There it is. He swears by his own name, because they were supposed to be swearing in his name. That's in the Torah. And instead they're swearing by Anat Yahu, the Anat who is the wife of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And they think they're doing righteousness. I'm filling in the part where they're swearing by Anat Yahu based on your papyrus, right? Jeremiah doesn't say the name of the Queen of Heaven. He just calls her the Queen of Heaven. He's saying, you're not going to ever swear by my name anymore as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh lives. And here we have, let's see, I don't know, this is more than 100 years after Jeremiah, someone who is still swearing by the Queen of Heaven in the name of Anat Yahu. I mean, this is incredible stuff, Professor. This is huge. This is huge stuff. Incredible. And one, it's a implementation of the prophecy of Jeremiah, right? He's saying they won't swear by his name, and then the guy isn't swearing by his name. He's swearing by a combination of the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and Anat. I mean, this is incredible. And they don't speak his name. This is me saying this, not the professor. They don't say the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, they drop the Vav. Or they drop the Hey, right? They call him Yahweh. I mean, this is incredible stuff.
The Judean temple has been destroyed at Elephantine. And it's been destroyed by Egyptian priests of the god Khnum, who lived nearby on the island.
When Arsames returned a few months later, the Jews of Elephantine had the satisfaction of seeing the priests of Khnum and Widrang punished, but that still left them with no temple. The Jews promptly petitioned to have the temple rebuilt. And in fact, among the documents found here is from the year 407, is one entitled A Petition Concerning the Rebuilding of the Temple of Yahweh. And it begins, "Now concerning the temple, when Cambyses came here, the temple was already built," showing that it had been here for quite some time. This put Arsames in a difficult position. Although he may have put Widrang and some of the priests of Qunum to death, he didn't want to upset the local population too much. It was all very well keeping his mercenaries happy, but he also needed to keep the Egyptians happy. And if the Egyptian populace was against the rebuilding of the temple, well, and so Arsames adopted a typical Eastern approach to the matter. He compromised. He stalled, he delayed. He told the Jews that they could rebuild their temple provided they got permission from the authorities in Jerusalem. He may have been more clever than the Jews of Elephantine realized, because at this time Jerusalem was controlled by Ezra and Nehemiah. And Arsames almost certainly knew this and may even have met them on his way to and from Persia. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were very strict about who they would let build temples. In fact, they wouldn't let anyone else build a temple. When the Samaritans, when Ezra and Nehemiah first came back to Jerusalem, the Samaritans came and said, "Do allow us to join in building the temple of Jehovah with you, because we worship the same God." And Ezra and Nehemiah gave them a very curt refusal, made enemies of them, in fact, by the curtness of their refusal, because their worship was not a strict monotheism. It was not strictly the form that Ezra and Nehemiah recognized. So Arsames undoubtedly knew that the authorities in Jerusalem would not give permission, and so he'd be in the clear, because he would then be able to say, "Well, it's not my fault, I'd gladly give you permission, but your own people refuse." And so the matter would be closed. Well, it all fell out more or less exactly as Arsames had planned.
A letter written by the Jews of Elephantine to the Jews in Jerusalem, to the Second Temple, saying, "Look, we want to rebuild this temple, and we need your help."
The Jewish authorities were not going to give permission for any other temple to be built, and especially not one in Egypt, and certainly not one where there wasn't strict monotheism. But they too were Easterners. They didn't send back an answer saying no. They simply sent no answer at all. And after a while, after waiting for ages, the Jews of Elephantine got the message. But they were determined. They weren't going to give up. And their next step, recorded thoroughly in the papyri that had been found here, was a very interesting one. The second petition was sent to Arsames, and a copy was sent to the sons of Sanballat the Samaritan. The Jews of Elephantine sent their petition to the Samaritans. If their own people would not give them permission, then the Samaritans would, they hoped.
And we have two copies of that letter. We have a first draft and a second draft.
Let's look at this letter. Look, you see the fibers. Look at that. Your servants Yadanya and his colleagues, the priests who are in Elephantine, the fortress.
And this is from 407, so it's 3 years later. It's already the second letter. I'm going to skip ahead because it's a long letter. Moreover, before this, at that time, this evil was done to us, a letter we sent to our Lord and to Yehochanan, the high priest, and his colleagues, the priests who are in Jerusalem. Now your servants, Yadanya and his colleagues and the Jews, all of them citizens of Elephantine, thus say, if to our Lord it is good, take thought of that temple to rebuild it, since they do not let us rebuild it. May a letter from you be sent to them about the temple of Yahweh, the God, to rebuild it, in Elephantine, the fortress, just as it had been built formerly. And the meal offering and the incense and the burnt offering they will offer on the altar of Yahweh, the God, in your name. And we shall pray for you at all times. They'll bring incense, burnt offering, and meal offering, which is really interesting, that they're bringing animal sacrifices at Elephantine, along with meal offerings and flour offerings and incense offerings. The reason that's interesting is Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12 talk about how offerings may only be brought to one place, which was understood, certainly in the original context, as the tabernacle, and later that was understood to be at the temple. At least that's how Josiah understood it, and that's why he went around destroying the high places. And here these people are in Elephantine saying, look, we bring sacrifices, not just incense and flour offering. We actually sacrifice animals, contrary to Leviticus 20:17 and Deuteronomy 12. And then later we have the memorandum, which leaves out the burnt offering, the animal sacrifice. And you mentioned that in your book. So this isn't the first letter. There's an earlier letter that we don't have that they sent asking for help to rebuild this temple. And then the really surprising thing to me, Professor, is they then mention they also sent a letter. It says to the Samaritans. Moreover, all these things in a letter we sent in our name to Delaiah and Shelemiah, sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria. And we know who Sanballat is. He's mentioned in the book of Nehemia, in the book of Nehemiah. So we have, they send a letter to the Jews, now a second letter saying, look, we want to rebuild our temple. Can you help us? This temple in Elephantine. And they also send it to the Samaritans. So can we stop there and talk about that? Why would they send it to the Samaritans? Meaning the common narrative, or what we read, at least in Ezra and Nehemiah, is that the Samaritans offered to participate in rebuilding the second temple, and the Jews said, hey, no, we're good. We don't want your participation. But here the Jews in Elephantine, they do want to collaborate with the Samaritans. So what's going on there?
Well, you know as much as I do.
Okay, fair enough.
This is...
it's surprising.
This is surprising, and it just shows that the conflict that was raised by Nehemiah didn't go into the next generation, because these are the sons of Sanballat. And by the way, here his name is written as it is in the Akkadian with the aleph, Sin Ubalit, not just Sanballat, which will be the abbreviated
that's interesting.
form.
Sin is the god of the moon god that we're going to talk about later.
Right.
Oh, that is very interesting.
Ubalit.
Wow.
Is his full name.
Wow. Okay.
And so they write to him too, because in Samaria they also worship this god Yahoo, and they want their influence. And when they get a response, they don't get a written response, but they get an oral response. And so what we have is a memorandum.
A memorandum with the answer. And just to be clear, the Samaritan leader, the son of Sanballat, whose name is Delaiah, he's writing a joint memorandum together with the Jewish leader, who is the successor of Nehemia. Right. I mean, that's really surprising.
Right.
But there it is. I mean, we have the document.
In the Elephantine archive.
And these two joined together to make the following statement.
Can you read us some of the response there?
It says, Lemivniyah, to build it, Biatre, on its place. In other words, not elsewhere. Kazi Havala Kadmin, as it had been before. In other words, you restore the status quo ante. Uminchata, and meal offering, Ulavonta, and incense. Yikarvun al madbacha, they should offer on the altar.
So they don't mention the animal sacrifices.
Lukavel zi lekadmin hava mitabein, as it had been done before, but they omit mention of the alvata,
which is the animal sacrifices. Right. And it's I think it's quite clear, and you mentioned this in your book, that this is presumably due to the prohibition from the Torah to bring sacrifices outside of Jerusalem. And then you bring the next letter, which is B22 in your book, offer for payment for reconstruction of the temple. And one of the things they say here, if our Lord and the temple of Yahweh, and something's missing, and the temple of Yahweh, the God of ours, be rebuilt in Elephantine, the fortress as formerly it was built, and sheep and ox and goat as burnt offerings are not made there, but only incense and meal offerings they offer there. And should our Lord a statement make about this afterwards, we shall give to the house of the Lord silver and barley, so they're offering to pay. But they're only offering to pay if you agree not to bring these animal sacrifices. I mean, this is, so I think it's a pretty convincing argument, I think, to me at least, that they're like, look, we want to help you guys, but you can't be spilling blood at the altar in Elephantine. That's reserved for Jerusalem.
In 402 BC, the Egyptians rebelled against the Persians and drove them out of the country. And in the rebellion, the temple of Yahweh here at Elephantine was again destroyed. It was never rebuilt. And 2 years later, we have the last reference to the Jews of Elephantine. Either they were withdrawn, or more likely, they were wiped out and exterminated in the fighting of the rebellion.
And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt.
Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn from following the Lord this day, to build an altar for burnt offerings or grain offerings or for sacrifices, besides the altar of the Lord our God, which is before his tabernacle.